For 30 years, she lived behind the walls of an asylum in the south of France. The doctors who treated her wrote, more than once, that she did not need to be there, that she could go home. She was one of the greatest sculptors of her age. And someone made certain she never left. To understand why a woman of rare and undeniable genius spent the last 30 years of her life behind locked doors, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. To a child who was strange in the way that only the truly gifted are strange. A girl who would disappear for hours, and when you found her, her hands were buried in the earth. Camille Claudel was born on the 8th of December, 1864, in Fère-en-Tardenois, a small town in the Aisne, in the north of France. Her father, Louis Prosper Claudel, was a civil servant, a registrar of mortgages, a practical and intelligent man whose work moved the family from one provincial town to the next. Her mother, Louise Athanaïs, came from a line of farmers and country priests, and she was, by every account that survives, a hard and conventional woman, reserved, withholding, difficult to please and almost impossible to warm. There is a detail here that matters, and it is worth sitting with. Before Camille was born, the Claudels had a first child, a son. He died when he was only a few weeks old, and some who have studied this family have wondered whether the mother, having lost the boy she wanted, never quite opened her heart to the daughter who came after. We cannot know what was in Louise Athanaïs' mind, but we do know that from the earliest years there was a coldness between mother and daughter that never thawed, and that would decades later cost Camille more than she could have imagined. 2 more children followed. A sister, Louise, born in 1866, who would become the mother's clear favorite, and a brother, Paul, born in 1868, who would grow into one of the great poets and diplomats of France. Remember that name, Paul Claudel, because the bond between Camille and her younger brother was the closest relationship of her early life. And it was the same brother who, many years later, would sign the papers that took her freedom away. But all of that was unimaginable in the countryside of her childhood. What Camille had, from the time she was very young, was clay. The region around Villeneuve, where the family had roots, was rich with a particular reddish earth, and Camille was drawn to it the way some children are drawn to water or to music. She did not play with it, she worked it. By the time she was 12 or 13, she was sculpting figures with a seriousness that unsettled the adults around her. Napoleon, David and Goliath. Whole compositions pulled out of the mud by a girl who had never been taught how. And this is the thing you have to understand about her. The talent was not a hobby. It was not charming. It was a kind of force, and it bent the entire household around it. She conscripted her younger siblings to pose for her and to fetch her materials. She demanded the family's attention for her work. Paul later remembered her not as a sweet older sister but as a commanding, almost ferocious presence, someone who already carried herself like an artist before anyone had given her permission to be one. Her father saw it. Whatever Louis Prosper Claudel lacked in warmth, he made up for in a clear-eyed recognition of what his daughter actually was. He did not dismiss her. He did not tell her that sculpture was no life for a young woman, though in 1870s France, that was precisely what almost everyone else would have said. Instead, he took her seriously, and when the family moved to the town of Nogent-sur-Seine, he made a decision that would change the course of her life. In Nogent lived a sculptor named Alfred Boucher, a successful and generous artist who had won acclaim at the Paris salons. Camille's father arranged for Boucher to look at her work, and Boucher, expecting perhaps the polite drawings of a provincial girl, was instead confronted with real ability. He began to teach her. He told her father plainly that this child had a gift that needed a city, a proper studio, real instruction. He told them she needed Paris. It is one thing to recognize a talent. It is another to upend your entire family for it. But that is what Louis Prosper Claudel did. Around 1881, when Camille was 16, the family split itself in two. The father stayed behind for his work, sending money, and the mother, the favored sister Louise, and young Paul moved with Camille to Paris into an apartment in Montparnasse so that a teenage girl could pursue sculpture. The mother resented it. She did not understand this daughter, did not approve of the ambition, and did not want her family rearranged around it. And so from the very start of Camille's real artistic life, there was a fracture running through the home. On one side, a father and a brother who believed in her. On the other, a mother who never would. In Paris, the doors of the École des Beaux-Arts were closed to her, because the most prestigious art school in France did not admit women. So Camille enrolled instead at the Académie Colarossi, one of the few places where a young woman could study the human form. She shared a studio with other aspiring women sculptors. She worked relentlessly, with a discipline that astonished those around her. And then Alfred Boucher, the man who had championed her, won a prize that called him away to Italy. He could no longer oversee his students. So he asked a friend, another sculptor, a man whose reputation was just beginning to thunder through Paris, to look in on them in his absence. The man's name was Auguste Rodin. She was barely 19, and nothing in her life would ever be the same. When Auguste Rodin first walked into that studio of young women, he was 42 years old. Camille was 19. And to understand what happened between them, both the brilliance and the wreckage, you have to understand that he was not yet the towering figure history would make of him. He was a man on the edge of fame, still hungry, still proving himself, still surrounded by doubters who whispered that his work was too raw, too alive, almost indecent in how truthfully it rendered the human body. Rodin had come up the hard way. He had been rejected 3 times from the École des Beaux-Arts, the same school that would later close its doors to Camille. He had spent years as an anonymous craftsman, doing decorative work for other men, watching his 30s pass without recognition. And then, around 1880, the French state had commissioned him to create a monumental bronze door for a planned museum of decorative arts. He called it the Gates of Hell. It was an enormous undertaking, swarming with figures, and it would consume him for decades. To build it, he needed hands, skilled hands, many of them. So when he looked at Camille's work, he was not looking at it the way a teacher looks at a student. He was looking at it the way a man drowning in a vast project looks at someone who might be able to swim. And what he saw stopped him. She could model the human form with a sensitivity that most working sculptors never achieve in a lifetime. Her sense of movement, of how a hand or a foot carries the weight and the feeling of a whole body, was already extraordinary. She was, in the most literal sense, gifted. Rodin recognized it immediately, and he brought her into his studio not merely as a pupil but as a paid assistant, one of the small circle of practitioners he trusted to work directly on his sculptures. Now, here is something you have to sit with, because it is at the heart of everything that came later. In the studio of a master like Rodin, the line between the master's work and the assistant's work was deliberately blurred. The great man conceived the vision. He shaped the major forms, but the delicate parts, the hands, the feet, the faces full of feeling, were often executed by his most talented assistants, and Camille was the most talented of them all. So the hands you admire on certain figures of the Gates of Hell may well be hers. The feet, the fine modeling of skin over bone, in works that the world has always credited entirely to Rodin, were in part the labor of a teenage girl whose name appears nowhere on them. This was not theft, exactly. It was simply how the system worked, and Camille entered into it willingly, hungry to learn, proud to be chosen. But it planted a seed. Because a person can give her finest work to another's name for only so long before the question begins to burn. Where do I end and he begin? For now, though, the relationship was a true meeting of equals in talent, if not in power. They worked side by side, day after day, in the dust and the wet clay and the smell of plaster. And something extraordinary began to happen. They were not simply teacher and student. They were 2 artists feeding each other. He sharpened her technique, gave her access to a professional world that would otherwise have been locked to a woman of her time, and she, in turn, gave him something too. Many who have studied the period believe that Camille's influence can be felt in Rodin's work of these years, a new tenderness, a new attention to the female form rendered from the inside rather than merely observed. She also became his model. Her face, her body, appear in his sculptures of this time. He looked at her constantly, studied her, reproduced her in clay and bronze and marble. There is an intimacy in that act, in spending months rendering another person's flesh, that is hard to separate from desire. And the desire was real, on both sides. But before we arrive there, hold on to the professional truth of it, because it is the foundation of her tragedy. By her early 20s, Camille Claudel was operating at the very highest level of European sculpture, not as a curiosity, not as a woman who dabbled, as a serious artist whose hands were good enough that one of the greatest sculptors who ever lived wanted them in his studio, touching his most important work. That is not a small thing. That is the proof, established early and beyond argument, that the woman who would later be called mad, locked away as incapable, was in fact one of the most capable artists France ever produced. She had a fierce, exacting temperament in the studio. She did not defer easily. She argued about technique, about form, about how a thing should be done, with a confidence that some found thrilling and others found impossible in a young woman. Rodin, to his credit in these early years, seemed to relish it. He had found not a disciple but a collaborator, someone who pushed back, someone whose judgment he came to trust, and so they fell into each other. The work and the feeling became impossible to untangle. The clay under their fingers and the closeness of their bodies became the same thing. She was a teenager when it began, and he was a middle-aged man with a life she did not yet fully understand. Because what Camille did not know, or did not let herself know, was that Auguste Rodin had not arrived alone. There was already a woman in his life, a woman who had been with him for nearly 20 years. And that woman was not going anywhere. The woman's name was Rose Buret. And to tell this part of the story honestly, you cannot make her a villain, and you cannot make Camille one either, because there were no villains here. There were only 3 people caught in something. None of them knew how to escape. Rose had been with Rodin since 1864, the very year Camille was born. She was a seamstress, a plain and uneducated working woman, and she had stood by him through all the lean years, the rejections, the poverty, the long climb from nothing. She had borne him a son. She cooked for him, kept his house, guarded his peace, asked for almost nothing. She was not his intellectual equal, and she could not follow him into the world of art and ideas. But she was loyal in a way that Rodin, for all his appetites, seemed to need like air. He never married her. Not for decades. But he never left her either. And into that arrangement walked Camille Claudel, 19 years old, blazing with talent and certainty, sharing his studio and then his bed. By around 1885, the relationship between them had become a full love affair, passionate and consuming. They were lovers and collaborators at once, and for a few years it must have felt to Camille like the center of the world. You have to try to picture what it was. 2 people who spoke the same secret language of clay and form, who could look at a half-finished figure and understand it without words. They worked together by day and were lovers by night. He rented a separate property, a crumbling old house called the Folie Le Prestre, sometimes known as the Close Payen, where they could meet away from Rose, away from the studio, away from everyone. It became their private world. They sketched there, made love there, talked about art and the future there. And the work that came out of those years is extraordinary. This was when Camille was at her most fertile as an artist, and when Rodin's own work took on a tenderness it had not had before. They modeled each other. They modeled the same subjects. Their styles came so close together in this period that scholars still argue over which hand made certain pieces. That is how deep the entanglement went. It was not only 2 bodies. It was 2 artistic visions bleeding into one another until you could barely tell where one ended. But, underneath the passion, there was always the unspoken fact. Rose, she did not go away. Rodin moved between the 2 women, and Camille, who was proud and absolute in everything she did, was expected to accept a share of a man who would not be wholly hers. For a while, she did. She was young, she was in love, and perhaps she believed what people in her position always believe, that he would choose her in the end, that the old loyalty would give way to the new fire. There is a document from these years that tells you how far it went. A contract, drawn up around 1886, in which Rodin promised himself to Camille in remarkable terms. He pledged to take no other pupil, to support her, to make her his only student, even to marry her and take her to Italy. It reads like the desperate vow of a man who knew he was failing the woman he claimed to love, trying to bind her to him with promises on paper. He did not keep them. He never took her to Italy as a wife. He never broke with Rose. The contract was a beautiful lie, and on some level he must have known it when he signed it. And this is the cruelty that was built into the whole thing from the start. Camille had given Rodin her youth, her body, her finest creative years, and a great deal of unattributed labor on his most celebrated works. In return, she got passion, yes, and an education no other woman of her time could have had. But she also got a permanent second place in the life of the man she loved. She was the brilliant mistress. Rose was the wife in all but name. And in the France of that era, that distinction was everything. It decided who was respectable and who was scandalous, who was a great man's partner and who was merely his weakness. It is worth saying plainly what this cost her, because the world has often preferred the romantic version. The truth is that loving Rodin damaged Camille standing before she had a chance to build it. To the art world of Paris, she was increasingly seen not as a sculptor in her own right but as Rodin's woman, his student, his muse, his mistress. Whatever she made would now be measured against him, suspected of being derivative of him, or worse, suspected of actually being his. The very closeness that fed her art also threatened to swallow her name. She seems to have understood this. The proud, ferocious girl who had commanded her whole family did not want to be anyone's shadow. And so, even in the depths of the affair, a tension was growing inside her, a need to pull away, to prove that she was not an echo of Auguste Rodin, but a force entirely her own. There is reason to believe that during these years, she also became pregnant, perhaps more than once, and that the pregnancies ended, whether by miscarriage or otherwise, the records do not say. The details remain debated, and it would be wrong to state as fact what cannot be known. But what is certain is that she emerged from this relationship without the marriage, without the child, without the public standing, and without the man. What she had instead was her work. And her work, it turned out, was about to become the only thing that could speak for her. If you want to know whether Camille Claudel was truly a genius, or merely a gifted woman standing in the light of a great man, you do not need to read what the critics said or what her family claimed. You only need to look at what she made when she finally pulled away from Rodin and worked alone. Because the work answers the question completely. And it answers it in her favor. Around the early 1890s, Camille began to separate herself, artistically and personally, from the man who had shaped and overshadowed her. She moved into her own studio. She set out to make sculpture that no one could mistake for Rodin's, sculpture that came from a place inside her that was entirely her own. And what emerged in this period is, by any honest measure, among the finest French sculpture of the age. Consider the waltz. She modeled it in the early 1890s. A pair of dancers locked together, the woman half melting into the man, the whole composition spiraling with motion. It is sensual and dizzying and alive. You can almost feel the turn of it, the way the two figures lean into a momentum that will either hold them up or fling them apart. When the French state considered commissioning a marble version, an inspector objected to the eroticism, the sheer physical intimacy of the embrace. He found it improper for a woman to have made. Think about that. The work was too powerful, too honest about desire, and the problem was not the work. The problem was who had dared to make it. Then there is the mature age, and this is the one that breaks your heart once you know the story behind it. She worked on it through the late 1890s. It shows three figures: a young woman, kneeling, naked, reaching out with both arms, pleading; an older man turning away from her; and an older woman, gaunt and skeletal, pulling the man along, drawing him into the future, and away from the girl who begs him to stay. The young woman's outstretched hands grasp at empty air. It does not take much to read it. The man is Rodin. The older woman is Rose, or age itself, or fate. And the kneeling girl, reaching, abandoned, is Camille. She had taken the deepest wound of her life and turned it into bronze. It is one of the most devastating autobiographical works in the history of art, a woman sculpting the exact moment of her own abandonment and putting it on a pedestal for the world to see. And it is, technically and emotionally, a masterpiece. There is a story, debated but persistent, that when Rodin saw it or learned of it, he was so disturbed by what it revealed that he intervened to block a state commission for it. Whether or not that is precisely what happened, the work itself stands as proof of a mind operating at the very summit of its powers, and she did not stop there. She made the wave, a small jade and bronze piece showing 3 tiny women crouching beneath a great curling wave about to break over them. It is utterly unlike anything Rodin made. It shows the influence of Japanese art, of Hokusai, filtered through her own sensibility. It is delicate, strange, modern, and entirely hers. No one looking at the wave could ever say she was imitating her former master. It announces a separate artist with a separate eye on the world. This is the central fact of her life, and it is the fact the rest of the story keeps trying to erase. By the 1890s, Camille Claudel was not a promising student. She was not a footnote to Rodin. She was a mature, original, formidable sculptor whose best work could stand beside anyone's. Some critics of the time saw it clearly. The writer Octave Mirbeau called her a revolt of nature, a woman of genius. She exhibited at the salons. She earned admirers. For a few years, it looked as though she might actually break through, might claim the name and the standing she had every right to. But the world was not built to let her. And here you have to understand the machinery she was up against, because it explains everything that came after. She was a woman in a field that did not believe women could be serious sculptors. Sculpture was physical, expensive, dependent on commissions, on patrons, on the favor of a state and an establishment that were entirely male. A male artist could be difficult, demanding, even scandalous, and it only burnished his legend. A woman who was difficult and demanding was simply unnatural. And she had no money of her own. Sculpture in marble and bronze is brutally expensive. You need materials, you need assistants, you need a foundry, you need patrons willing to pay. Rodin had all of that. Camille had only her father's modest support and whatever she could earn, which was never enough. So even at the height of her powers, she was working in poverty, scraping for the funds to cast a single piece, watching her former lover receive the great commissions and the glory, while she struggled to keep her studio heated. The injustice of it would have curdled a saint. She had given her finest years to Rodin's reputation. She had made work the equal of his, and she watched the world hand him everything and hand her almost nothing. While many of those same critics murmured that whatever was good in her work, she must have learned from him. She knew the truth. She knew exactly how good she was, and she knew exactly how the world was choosing to see her. And slowly, in the years after the break, that knowledge began to turn. The pride that had carried her since childhood started to sour into something darker. The conviction that she was being denied her due, which was entirely accurate, began to harden into a conviction that she was being actively persecuted. And at the center of that persecution, in her mind, stood one man. The end of a love affair is rarely a single moment. It is a long unraveling, a series of small deaths, and Camille's break with Rodin was no different. It stretched across years, from roughly 1893 to the very end of the decade. And you cannot point to one afternoon and say, there, that is when it broke. But you can watch it happen. You can watch a brilliant, proud woman slowly understand that the thing she had staked her life on was never going to be hers. By the early 1890s, Camille had moved out of the shared orbit and into her own studio. She had stopped working as Rodin's assistant. She wanted to be Camille Claudel, sculptor, and not Rodin's anything. But pulling away from the studio meant pulling away from the man, and pulling away from the man meant facing the things she had perhaps always known and never accepted. He would not leave Rose. He had never been going to leave Rose. The promises on that old contract were ash. There is reason to believe she was pregnant during these years, and that it ended, though as I said before, the records do not let us say more than that with certainty. What we can say is that she came out of the relationship with empty hands. No marriage, No child to show for it, no respectable place in the world. Just the wreckage of more than a decade, and the dawning recognition that she had given the best of herself to a man who had, in the end, kept his other life intact and let her go. And the cruelty of it was compounded by everything we talked about in the last part. Because she did not simply lose a lover. She lost a lover who was also, professionally, becoming a god. While Camille struggled in poverty, Rodin's fame swelled into something monumental. He became the most celebrated sculptor in the world. Every year his stature grew, and every year the gap between them widened, and every year it became more impossible for her to be seen as anything other than the woman he had once kept. Imagine carrying that. Imagine knowing your own gift, knowing it absolutely, and watching the man who shared your bed and borrowed your hands ascend into immortality while you cannot afford to cast your own work in bronze. Imagine the people who should have championed you, instead asking, in that knowing way, whether your best ideas were really his. The injustice was real. It was not in her head. That is the part that matters, and it is the part that is so often forgotten. Camille Claudel was genuinely wronged. She was genuinely overlooked, genuinely impoverished, genuinely overshadowed by a man and a system that had taken a great deal from her and given little back. But here is where the story turns, slowly and terribly. Because a real injustice, brooded over long enough, in isolation, by a mind already strained, can begin to grow past its true dimensions. It can spread. It can start to explain everything. And somewhere in these years, that is what began to happen to Camille. At first it was understandable, even rational. Rodin had blocked or complicated certain opportunities for her, or so she believed, and there is real evidence that his vast influence did shape who received commissions and who did not. It would have been naive of her to think his shadow did not fall across her path. So when she began to suspect that he was working against her, she was not simply imagining things. There was a kernel of truth. But the suspicion did not stay the size of its kernel. Over time it swelled. She came to believe that Rodin was not merely a rival who sometimes obstructed her, but the center of a vast conspiracy organized entirely around her destruction. She believed he was stealing her ideas, sending agents to spy on her, plotting to take her work and pass it off as his own. She believed that a whole network of people answered to him, and that their purpose was to ruin her, to rob her, perhaps to kill her. The man who had genuinely wronged her became, in her mind, the architect of all suffering. You can see, if you look at it closely, how the true thing and the false thing were tangled together so tightly that no one could pull them apart, including her. The persecution she imagined grew directly out of a persecution that had been partly real, and that is what made it so resistant to argument. When someone has actually been treated unjustly, you cannot simply tell them their sense of injustice is madness, because part of it is not. The wronged truth gave the delusion its terrible strength. Through the late 1890s and into the new century, she withdrew. She saw fewer people. She trusted fewer people. The studio that had once been a place of furious creation became a place she barricaded against an enemy who was not mostly coming. Her family watched her recede. Her brother Paul, who loved her and who was building his own life as a diplomat posted abroad, saw the changes in her with growing alarm during his returns to France. The fierce sister of his childhood was becoming someone he no longer fully recognized. And through all of it, there was one person who did not turn away. Her father, Louis Prosper Claudel, the man who had believed in her from the beginning, who had moved his family to Paris for her, who had taken her talent seriously when the whole world told him not to. He kept sending money. He kept defending her. He stood between his troubled, gifted daughter and a family that was running out of patience, and a society that had no place for a woman like her. As long as he lived, Camille was safe. He was the wall that held everything back. And in 1913, that wall was about to fall. To understand what the last free years of Camille's life were actually like, you have to step inside the studio with her. Not the bright workshop of her youth, full of clay and ambition, but the place it became. A locked room in Paris, on the Quai de Bourbon. where one of the great sculptors of France lived in conditions that would have shamed the city if anyone had bothered to look. She had stopped letting most people in. The windows were often shuttered. Cats wandered through the rooms, dozens of them by some accounts, and the place fell into a deepening squalor. She dressed in old clothes, neglected herself, and went out rarely, usually after dark. The proud, commanding girl who had bent her whole family to her now lived like a recluse, suspicious of every knock at the door. Neighbors reported a strange woman who muttered, who hoarded, who seemed to be at war with enemies no one else could see. And the enemy, always, was Rodin. In her mind he had become enormous, a spider at the center of a web that covered all of Paris. She wrote letters, some of which survive, and they are difficult to read, because the intelligence in them is so clearly intact, even as the reasoning has gone somewhere terrible. She described, in clear and forceful prose, how Rodin's gang was conspiring to steal her work, how they crept into her studio while she slept, how they meant to profit from her ideas and then be rid of her. The handwriting is firm, the grievances are detailed, and the whole structure rests on a foundation that is not there. This is the cruelty of what was happening to her, and it is worth slowing down for. Because the most haunting thing about Camille in these years is not that she had lost her mind. It is how much of her mind she had kept. She could still think clearly about almost everything else. She could still, when she chose, work the clay. The delusion was not a fog that covered her whole self. It was a single, fixed, immovable belief, lodged at the center of an otherwise lucid person, and everything she experienced got bent around it. And then there was the destruction. This is perhaps the hardest part of the whole story to sit with. In these years, Camille Claudel began to destroy her own work. Periodically, in fits, she would take a hammer to the sculptures in her studio, smashing finished and half-finished pieces, reducing months and years of labor to fragments and dust. We do not know how much she destroyed. We will never know. Entire works by one of the finest sculptors of the age, gone, broken by the only hands that could have made them. She seems to have believed that if she did not destroy them, Rodin's agents would come and steal them. So she got there first. Think about what that means. The world had failed to give her the recognition she deserved, and now in her isolation, she was completing the erasure herself, doing to her own art what she feared her enemy would do. It is one of the most painful images in the history of art. A genius alone in a shuttered room, demolishing her own legacy to keep it safe from a thief who mostly was not coming. Through all of this, two forces pulled in opposite directions over her fate. On one side stood her mother, and increasingly her sister Louise. Louise Athanaïs had never understood this daughter, never approved of her, never forgiven her for the scandal of Rodin, for the unwomanly ambition, for the chaos she trailed behind her. The mother had moved out of Paris and would have nothing to do with Camille's life. To her, this daughter had become a source of shame, a stain on a respectable family. The coldness that had been there since the very beginning, that we talked about in the first part, had hardened into something close to rejection. On the other side stood her father. Louis Prosper Claudel was old now, but he had never wavered. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his daughter was both gravely troubled and genuinely great, and that those two facts did not cancel each other out. He kept paying her rent. He kept sending money for materials and food. He visited when he could, and he insisted, against the growing impatience of his wife and other daughter, that Camille be left in peace in her studio. He was not blind to her condition. He simply refused to let it become an excuse to lock her away. As long as he was alive, she remained free, a poor and frightened recluse, but free, surrounded by her work and her cats, mistress of her own days. Her brother Paul occupied an agonized middle ground. He loved her. She had been the brilliant, ferocious companion of his childhood, the one who had pulled him into the world of art and ambition. But Paul had become a devout Catholic and a rising diplomat, posted to far corners of the world, and he saw his sister only in glimpses, returning from abroad to find her further gone each time. He was horrified by her squalor, frightened by her ravings, and torn between his devotion and his revulsion. He could not fix her. He could not stay. and each departure left her a little more alone. So the family arranged itself into a fragile, unstable balance. The father holding the door open, the mother and sister wanting it shut, the brother away at the ends of the earth, loving her from a distance he could not close, and Camille at the center, deteriorating, brilliant, terrified, smashing her own masterpieces in a locked room. It could not hold. Everyone in the family seemed to sense it. The whole arrangement depended on one aging man's life and one aging man's will. In March of 1913, Louis Prosper Claudel died, and within 10 days, everything his protection had held back came crashing down on his daughter. Louis Prosper Claudel died on the 2nd of March, 1913. He was 76 years old, and there is a detail here so cruel that it almost feels invented, except that it is true. No one told Camille that her father was dead. The one person who had defended her all her life was gone, and the family did not tell her. She did not attend the funeral. She did not know she had lost her protector until long after the ground had closed over him. What happened next happened fast. On the 7th of March, just 5 days after the father's death, Paul Claudel signed a request for his sister's committal to a psychiatric institution. A doctor was found who, after an examination, certified that she was suffering from a persecutory delusional disorder and required confinement. And on the 10th of March, 1913, 8 days after her father died, the men came. Picture it. Because the script of her life has been building to this image from the very first sentence. They arrived at the studio on the Quai de Bourbon. They came for her by force, orderlies sent from the asylum, and they took her out of the only world she had, past the surviving sculptures and the tools she had worked with for 30 years, and they drove her to Ville-Évrard, an institution east of Paris. She was 48 years old. She struggled. She did not understand why this was happening or who had ordered it, and she would never live as a free woman again. Now we arrive at the question the title promised to answer. Why? Why was a woman of undeniable genius taken from her home and shut away? And why did it last not a year, not 5 years, but 30? And the honest answer is that there is no single answer. There is a tangle of them. And you have to hold all of them at once, because the truth of it lives in the tangle. Start with the part that was real. Camille was genuinely unwell. This is not the invention of a callous family. The delusions of persecution were real. The destruction of her own work was real. The squalor, the isolation, the inability to manage her own life were real. By the standards of 1913, and arguably by the standards of any era, she was a woman in the grip of a serious mental illness. Something had to be done, and her father's death removed the only person who had been doing it. So far, this looks like a family making a hard, sad, defensible decision about a relative who could no longer care for herself. But now hold the decision up to the light and turn it, and the other facts begin to show through. Look at the speed. 8 days. The father is barely buried before the committal is set in motion. There is no sense here of a long, agonized attempt to find another way. No trying of gentler measures first. The moment the protector was gone, the people who had wanted the door shut moved to shut it, with a swiftness that suggests the decision had been waiting, fully formed, for the chance to act. Look at who signed. It was Paul, the brother who loved her, but it was the mother, Louise Athanaïs, who was the driving will behind it. The woman who had been cold to Camille since the cradle, who had never forgiven her the scandal of Rodin or the shame of her unwomanly life, was now in a position to remove this troublesome daughter from sight entirely. The lifelong rejection we have traced from the very first part did not soften at the end. It found its final form in a set of asylum papers. And look at the world she lived in. Camille was a woman in a society where a woman who refused to be respectable, who lived alone, who made scandalous art, who had been a great man's mistress, who dressed strangely and spoke wildly, was already understood to be a kind of failure of womanhood. The line between a difficult unconventional woman and a madwoman was thin, and it was drawn by men, and it was enforced by families. It is impossible to know how much of Camille's confinement was about the illness in her mind, and how much was about the offense of her life. The two were never cleanly separable, not in 1913, perhaps not even to the family itself. Within days of her arrival at Villevrard, the newspapers caught the scent. Some reports treated it as a scandal, hinting that a sane woman, an inconvenient woman, an artist, had been locked away by her family. The questions that we are still asking now were being asked then, in real time. Was she mad enough to need this? Or was she simply too much, too gifted, too ungovernable, too embarrassing for a respectable bourgeois family to bear? The First World War came the following year, and with it Ville-Évrard was evacuated. In 1914, Camille was transferred south, away from Paris, away from anyone who had ever known her, to the asylum of Montavergues near Avignon, in the south of France. It was hundreds of miles from her family, from her brother when he was even in the country, from her old life, her studio, her work, her city. The distance was not an accident of war alone. It made her easy to forget. And here is the thing that turns an illness into a tragedy, the thing the rest of this story will have to answer for. Camille Claudel was committed in 1913 as a woman in crisis. That much can be understood. But she did not stay 1 year. She stayed 30, and almost from the beginning, the people running the asylum, Zax, would say she did not need to. The door had closed. The question now was whether anyone would ever open it again. She lived for 30 more years. 30 years inside the walls of Montavergues, in the dry hills near Avignon, in a place she never chose and never stopped trying to leave. And the most unbearable fact of those years, the fact that turns this from a sad story into something closer to an indictment, is that she may not have needed to be there at all. The letters survive. That is what makes it so hard to look away from. Camille wrote, year after year, in that same firm, intelligent hand, and her letters from the asylum are some of the most heartbreaking documents in the history of art. She begged to come home. She wrote to her mother, to her brother, to anyone she thought might listen. She insisted she was not mad, that she had been put there unjustly, that she only wanted to return to her work and her freedom. She described the cold, the bad food, the other patients, the slow erasure of the years. She did not rave in these letters. She pleaded, and she reasoned, and she remembered. And here is the part you have to sit with. The doctors agreed with her, at least in part. More than once, the physicians at Montavergues wrote to her family to say that Camille was calm, that she was lucid much of the time, that her condition did not require this level of confinement, and that she could be released into her family's care or placed somewhere gentler, closer to home. The institution that held her told the people who had put her there that she could come out. They said no. Her mother, above all, refused. Louise Athanaïs wrote back to the asylum and made her position plain. She did not want Camille released. She did not want her near the family. She instructed the doctors that her daughter was to receive no visitors except family members. And the family in practice almost never came. The mother never visited Camille. Not once in all those years until her own death in 1929. She had a daughter alive and asking for her, a few days' journey away, and she chose silence and distance until the end of her own life. Read one of the mother's letters and the coldness we traced from the very first part of this story reaches its final, frozen form. She wrote of Camille as a burden, a danger, a shame, someone whose freedom would only bring chaos back into the family's life. The rejection that began beside a cradle in 1864 ended here, in a refusal to bring a sick and pleading daughter home. There were, the family insisted, good reasons. Camille was difficult. Her care would be hard, the scandal would reopen. But underneath every reason was the same old current, the one that had been running since the beginning. They did not want her. Paul is harder to judge, and it would be wrong to make him a simple villain, because nothing in this story is simple. He loved his sister, or had loved her. He visited her, but rarely, perhaps a dozen times across 3 decades, fitting her in between diplomatic postings that took him across the world. He wrote about her in his journals with grief and guilt and a strange religious resignation, as though her suffering were a cross she had been given to bear. He could have fought harder to bring her home. He did not. He let his mother's will, and then after his mother's death his own inertia, keep his sister locked away. He chose again and again not to act, and a choice not to act, repeated for 30 years, is still a choice. So she waited. She refused for a long time to make sculpture in the asylum, telling visitors she would not work there, that her art belonged to the life they had taken from her. The hands that had modeled figures fine enough for Rodin's masterpieces went still. The genius we spent the first half of this story establishing, the real and proven genius, sat unused in a southern asylum, year after year, while the woman who held it grew old. And then the war came again. The Second World War, and with it France fell, and shortages spread, and the institutions that housed the helpless were the first to be forgotten. In the asylums of occupied and Vichy France, patients died in great numbers from cold and hunger and neglect. Camille, old now, frail, decades into her confinement, suffered through it like the rest. On the 19th of October, 1943, she died at Monteverges. She was 78 years old. She had spent 30 years inside. Her brother did not come to the funeral. No family member did. She was buried in a communal plot at the asylum, in ground reserved for the institution's dead, and later even those remains were disturbed and lost. There is no grave you can visit that holds Camille Claudel. The greatest woman sculptor of her age lies nowhere and everywhere, her bones mixed with strangers, unmarked, unclaimed. So return at the end to the question the title asked, why was a genius locked away for 30 years? And you find that the answer was never really about her mind. Her mind was the reason she went in. It was not the reason she stayed. She stayed because a mother could not love her, because a brother would not fight for her, because a society had no place for a woman who was too gifted and too strange and too inconvenient to keep at home. She stayed because the doctors said let her go, and the family said no. The work survived her, in the end. The pieces she did not destroy hang now in museums that bear her name beside Rodin's, studied, treasured, finally hers. The world came around, it always does, long after it can do any good. But it is worth sitting with the shape of it. A girl knelt in the red earth of the French countryside, working clay into life with hands that were already extraordinary, and an old woman died in a southern asylum, forgotten, having made nothing for 30 years, asking only to go home. Between those two images lies everything we have ever gotten wrong about what we owe the people who are not like us. She was not mad enough to deserve it. Almost no one ever is.